Sash. Hi, welcome everybody. Um, just to let you know that if you're wanting to ask any questions, you're welcome to save them to the end. But if you want to ask questions as I'm talking, I'm happy to accept questions as well. You are welcome to put your mics on, but most people would like to put questions in the chat. So if you haven't used Teams before, the chat is just the speech bubble symbol. And if you click on that, you should get a chat pane come up. And then if you've got any questions that you want to ask while I'm doing my talk, you can pop them in that chat pane. So today I am going to, I'll set myself a big challenge. I'm going to tell you how studying criminology can help us save the world. And I'll see if you agree with me when I get to the end of it. And I'm going to talk to you today about one of the areas that I teach in and I carry out research in, which is green criminology, environmental justice and animal harm. So in this session, I'm just going to start off by saying a little bit about me and some of the research that I've been involved in. I'm then going to introduce you to what green criminology is. I'm then going to put forward my argument as to why I think criminologists can help save the world. And then I'm going to talk through one project example, so of a piece of research that I carried out for the World Wildlife Fund for Nature, both in the UK and then latterly in Malaysia. So just to start off with me and my sort of criminology and policing journey, how did I get to be doing the kinds of research that I'm going to talk to you about today? So at university, at undergraduate and postgraduate level, I studied law and criminology, including a master's in criminology and criminal justice. After I did that, I was lucky enough to get a job doing something that I knew didn't even exist. I knew nothing about, but it was a great job and I really enjoyed it. It's a crime analyst for Sussex Police. So I moved from the Midlands down to the southeast coast and I worked for Sussex Police for 3.5 years. And routinely analysing the crimes that were taking place in the local area to look for patterns, look for known offenders, to link crimes together, to do hotspot mapping, and to advise the police on how to respond to the crimes that they were dealing with. I really enjoyed that, but I've always loved being at university, and my dream job was always to be back at university. I never really wanted to stop being a student. So I managed to secure work as a research fellow for University College London in their crime science lab, not a forensics lab. We were just doing criminology research, but that's what they called it. And I did that for 4 years before I then moved to Huddersfield and became a senior lecturer in criminology and policing. And I've now been here for 15 years. So if you've got any questions about what it's like at the University of Huddersfield, I'm probably very well placed to answer them for you. So that's kind of the career that I had on the back of studying criminology at university. I also worked as a volunteer police officer, a special constable, whilst I was doing that as well. So that's kind of where I got to where I am. My interests in terms of criminology and policing particularly relate to things around crime prevention. Why we get particular patterns in crime, especially looking at the places that crime occurs. So my PhD looked at why crime concentrates in specific types of premises. So why does crime concentrate in licensed premises and it doesn't really occur much in libraries and churches? But more importantly, when you look at all of the licensed premises, pubs and clubs in a particular area, why is it that a few of them have lots and lots of crime and most of them have very little crime? And we call this risky facilities, and that's what my PhD was in. I've always carried on doing research that's closely associated with policing and working closely with the police. So I've always been particularly interested in issues around crime analysis and these kinds of crime patterns and prevention. But I've also always had a love of animals. So when I was about 11 years old, I featured in our local newspaper because I'd sold off a lot of my old toys and comics and things, and raised what was then a large amount of money, £36 for our local RSPCA shelter. And I've always been interested in wanting to do something to try and save animals and to make their life more comfortable and protect them from harms that humans might cause to them. So it was that in around about 2008, I realised that there might be scope to take what I love about doing criminology and policing and start to apply that to some of my other concerns around animals and the environment and climate change. And this was really around the early days of green criminology, which I'm going to tell you about in just a moment. And I started off, my very first thing that I ever wrote about this was looking at how we could apply what we know from sort of crime prevention principles that are very well established and think about how we could use those crime prevention principles to try and stop illegal wildlife trade, in particular looking at elephant ivory poaching. And I've never looked back since then. And this has been where most of my research interest has lain since then. So I wanted to share some of this with you and tell you about why I think this branch of criminology, green criminology, is so incredibly important. So green criminology is a sort of subsection of broader criminology. And it's really about applying the kind of theories and explanations that we have in criminology, our understanding of crime and criminal behaviour, and how we respond to those types of crime to areas that fall within the interest of green criminologists. And there are two different ways that we can conceive of this. So some people focus on regulated behaviour that results in environmental harm. So this is usually things that are crimes, so environmental crimes. So that includes illegal wildlife trade, and it would include things like deliberate pollution of waterways, for example, or the obnoxious substances. However, there are also people within green criminology who are interested in broader conceptions of harms, not just narrowly thinking about the crimes that have been made illegal in certain countries. So these green criminologists, and I would also include myself in this category, are people who are concerned about broader ideas of harms against environments, humanity, and other animals. And that means that it doesn't just limit us to looking at things that are criminal offences, but also things that are socially harmful, or things that perhaps they ought to be criminal offences, but because we don't take them seriously enough, they haven't been made crimes. So this is a more critical approach within green criminology. Now, to be clear, green criminology is an umbrella term. It isn't a single theory or way of looking at ideas or explaining problems within the environment. It's simply a way of bringing together criminologists who are interested in applying their knowledge and expertise to these particular areas, so issues around the environment and animals. And we might think about these problems and these harms in a number of different ways. So some people might come to this from an environmental justice perspective, and this kind of centres humans, so it's an anthropocentric approach, and it considers why we need to protect the environment and biodiversity and animals because of the benefits that that brings to us as humans. For example, having access to clean water. Alternatively, we might take an ecological justice perspective, which is more interested in centering the idea of the biosphere. So the idea that we need to have a balanced natural environment, regardless of any benefits that that might bring to humans. And then there is an alternative perspective, which is a species justice perspective. And this is particularly the approach that I tend to take in most of my work. And this can be thought of as quite similar to the idea of animal rights. So a species justice perspective recognises that non-human animals are treated differently and treated as if they are less important than humans, and therefore they suffer both the impacts of environmental harm, but also specific harms against individual animals as well. And that might include things like animal abuse or pet neglect. It might include things like intensive farming, or indeed it might include things like illegal wildlife trade. So the best way to explain to people what green criminology is to present you with a whole range of very difficult issues that is currently being faced within society that green criminologists would be interested in. So the table that you can see on the screen at the moment does exactly that. It's not an exhaustive list, it's just some examples. And the first column are things that in this country and many other countries are already criminal offences, and they relate to environments or animals. And then the second column are things that in many countries aren't actually criminalised, but they still cause significant amounts of harm. And therefore, green criminologists would be interested in exploring them, how we might tackle them, and why indeed it is that they haven't actually been criminalised. So I'm not going to read all of these out to you, but I'm just going to pick out a few examples, particularly things that you may be less familiar with. So you can see from the crime side of that table, we've got illegal logging, which I'm sure you'll be aware of. So this is where people are carrying out deforestation and they're chopping down trees, usually large forests or rainforests, and they're doing that against criminal regulations that exist in that country. So often this is large scale illegal logging taking place. Black market CFCs are the illicit trade, the illegal trade in chlorofluorocarbons, which were banned many years ago because of the impact they were having on producing a hole in the ozone layer. That ban has been very, very effective, and the ozone layer is actually now very close to knitting itself back together into healing. But there remains a black market for these substances, so people are selling them illegally with the therefore the environmental effects. Also on there, we've got IUU fishing, which is illegal, undeclared and unregulated fishing. So throughout the world, there's all sorts of regulations and controls relating to how fishing should be carried out that try to limit things like the harms that are caused by fishing, particularly overfishing, and also the harms of bycatch. So catching things that they shouldn't catch. Dolphins, for example, would be an obvious one, but also damage to things like by reefs, coral reefs, etc. So there's lots of regulations in with regards to fishing, but there's also a lot of illegal activity that breaches those regulations. This is harmful not only for fish and fish stocks, but it's also harmful for the people involved in these kinds of activities. So there's also lots of evidence of documented human rights abuses and effectively modern slavery as part of the IUU fishing trade. So you can see we've got the animal concerns and the human concerns coming together there. Moving over to the harm side of this table, again, I'll just pick out a couple of examples that you may be less familiar with. So one that I always think is particularly interesting to tell people about is biopiracy and corporate colonization. And this involves usually large multinational companies based often in developed countries, going into developing countries and setting up a factory, taking land, setting up a factory, removing often natural resources. Perhaps it's something that produces an oil that can be used in cosmetics, for example, or a foodstuff. Processing those and then taking all of the profits out of that country back to the home country of that corporation. So the local population don't tend to benefit from this, and indeed they are harmed by it because their sustainable practices and their abilities to themselves utilise the products of the land have been removed by these large corporations. And in most countries, this kind of behaviour is actually perfectly legal. So this is something to particularly interest green criminologists, but it's not something that's actually a criminal offence. Another one just to pick out on there, again, just to show the real scope of the kinds of things that green criminologists might be interested in, is growing concerns about the impacts of climate change in terms of the impact on vulnerable groups and internally displaced people and refugees. So it's predicted that if climate change isn't reversed, we know that we're going to have large-scale droughts and large-scale flooding. And this is particularly likely to impact people in countries that have least contributed to climate change and are least in a position to be able to protect themselves from it. What that means is we're going to get large numbers of potentially climate refugees, so people having to move large movements of people from countries, particularly coastal countries or areas that are most likely to experience drought, in order to try and move elsewhere to land where they're able to be sustained. And we know that when these kinds of large-scale movements of people happen, that can also, along with other right conditions, can increase the likelihood of abuses of those displaced people, which potentially could result in things such as genocidal activities taking place. So some really, really serious crimes that might be linked to the impacts of climate change, and a whole range of things that green criminologists are interested in. So how can criminologists try and save the world? Why has criminology got anything to say about things like climate change and animal harm? In criminology, you'll find, if you look at how criminology is studied in universities now compared to how it was when I went to university, there's been a real shift in focus in terms of criminology. So we're still interested in theory and explanations and traditional forms of crime, but there's a growing interest and shift towards a focus on things like violent extremism, transnational crime, cybercrime and environmental harm, because these are really the large concerns facing society. And criminology needs to be able to respond to these. It's also the case that the boundaries of criminology are starting to expand. And this isn't something new, it's happened in the past, but for the last 30 years or so, criminology has perhaps narrowed down to a real focus on very traditional, very formal criminal activity, so burglaries and car crime and homicides and so forth. But actually, criminology didn't used to be like that, particularly through the sort of 60s and the 70s, when criminology was really growing as a discipline. It was actually very interested instead in social harm. It wasn't just about the focus of crime. but they were interested in kind of the broader harms and disputes between people and harms that weren't necessarily criminalised. And this was really important because at that time, lots of things that are now criminal offences weren't criminal offences or weren't of interest to sociologists and criminologists. For example, things like bullying and violence in the workplace, abuse against women, for example, really only started to come onto the agenda through the sort of 1960s and 1970s. And that was because these quite critical approaches that were taken that didn't just say, if it's not a crime, we're not interested in it, but said these things cause harm. And if they cause harm, as criminologists, we should be interested in trying to explain them and reduce that harm from happening. So this really lends itself to a study of green and environmental issues. It means, therefore, that the subject isn't just constrained by the things that the state defines as crime. And this is really important for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because the state might not be taking seriously the things that are actually very, very harmful to people. What actions being taken to reduce climate change, for example. So if we just wait for the state to criminalise behaviour, the harm is already going to be done. And it's too late. We can't wait for that. But it's also really important because in some countries, the state might actually be the person who's committing the harm. They might be the criminal, in inverted commas. They might have no interest in acting because it protects them, it's in their interests or powerful groups' interests to keep the status quo and to not try and tackle some of these really thorny problems. And again, actually, therefore, that's why it's really important for criminologists to think about looking at these issues more broadly and considering the role that power and influence plays in what gets criminalised and what gets tackled. So these are other areas where green criminology can play a part. And this is why I think criminologists are one of the groups who are at the forefront of actually pushing social change in this regard. We know that climate change, environmental degradation, biodiversity loss and species extinction are some of the biggest threats that are facing humanity. And criminology really has a lot to offer in tackling these problems, even if you haven't previously thought of them as anything to do with crime. Criminology is naturally multidisciplinary. So it's a bit of a vampire subject, criminology is. We'll have a bit of law and we'll have a bit of sociology and a bit of psychology and some geography, maybe even some biology in there. But we borrow from lots of other disciplines and we bring that knowledge to try and explain issues around crime and social harm. And that's what we need when we're tackling issues around conservation, climate, environmental degradation. Criminologists are experts in investigating the processes that are involved in creating crime, representing it, how it's talked about, and how we respond to the crime problem, or we can use the word harm in its place. That's what we do. We try and explain why it happens. We look at how it develops. We look at how the media talk about these harms and problems, and we talk about the best ways to respond to it. How do we prevent this from happening? And that's exactly what we need to think about in terms of the environment as well. Criminologists are also experts in explaining human behaviour that harms others. That's what we do. That's what we try to theorise about all the time. And here we're talking about human behaviour that is impacting upon other humans, animals and the environment. In criminology, it's also really important that we have a really good awareness of differential impact. So recognising that harms tend to impact upon different people in different locations to a lesser or greater extent. So some people are much more likely to be victimised. Some people are much more likely to be vulnerable to crime and harm. And that's just the same when we think about environmental crimes and climate change as well. So certain countries, certain groups, vulnerable minorities are far more likely to be impacted by these environmental harms. And again, that's something that criminology is very interested in and very used to dealing with. Criminologists also have knowledge of processes and the effectiveness of different types of regulatory frameworks. In other words, we look at how the police work and we look at systems of control and regulation, and we look at whether that's effective in catching and identifying offenders. We look at how to prosecute people. We look at how the criminal justice system operates and whether it's effective or not. And again, these are all useful things that we can bring to trying to tackle some of these questions. How do we control the behaviours that are resulting in climate change or environmental pollution or are resulting in the extinction of endangered species? How do we control them in an effective way and stop those harms from occurring? So we've got this expertise, we know how to respond to traditional crime, so why can't we also apply that to looking at these other types of social harm as well? Should we be trying to prevent this type of behaviour? How can informal social control play a role in people's behaviour that might harm the environment? What kinds of enforcement are effective? Does punishment work? Are sentences appropriate? Should we be trying to look to rehabilitate environmental offenders or to restore environmental environments or resettle people and stop people from offending in the future? We already know all of this in relation to traditional crime. This is what we've spent 70, 80, 90 years researching and becoming experts in, and we can now apply this to green issues. So I just want to now say a little bit about one project example that gives you an idea about the kinds of research that a green criminologist might do and the sorts of things that you might hear us talking about as we teach criminology and draw on our research experience. So there are a couple of things I could pick from that I wanted to tell you about, and this is the one that I decided on. This is a project that I worked on that originally started out as a project for the WWF in the UK, and then ended up actually having an impact on working with the WWF in Malaysia. And the idea was to look at the sentencing for illegal wildlife trade. And in the end, it resulted in the introduction of sentencing guidelines for wildlife trade offences within Malaysia. So this is what came about. Illegal wildlife trade basically exists because a large number of species are at risk of extinction throughout the world, and I'm sure you will all be very well aware of this. So there is something called the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Flora and Fauna, which we call CITES for short. And this is a convention that's seeking to protect species from going extinct as a result of illegal trade. So that convention identifies, through help of member states and the IUCN Red List, which species are at risk. And then it effectively bans trade in those species. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but for the purposes of today, it effectively either bans that trade or there can be strict quotas for species that are vulnerable rather than endangered or critically endangered. As you can see from the graphic there, there's more than 26,500 species are threatened with extinction, which is over a quarter of all the species that have been assessed. So we need to have strict controls. Now, they're at risk of extinction because of things like habitat loss as well, but illegal wildlife trade for many species is one of the biggest threats that they face. So that convention requires all of the countries who sign up to it to create criminal law in their home country that makes it illegal to trade in listed species. But that illegal trade still occurs. So these bans are effective, but lots of illegal trade still takes place. It's really difficult to know how much because this is a very hidden crime. We don't know much about it, and the victims of this, the animals themselves, clearly can't come forward and tell us. So it means that we have to rely on estimates that are very, very broad. But to give you a sense of the size of the problem, the United Nations Environmental Programme in 2014 estimated that the illegal trade in wildlife was worth somewhere between 50 and 150 billion US dollars annually across the globe. And there are other estimates that have been made around those kinds of amounts. The IUCN have said that illegal wildlife trade is the fourth largest illegal activity in the world. Some people have even suggested it's the second. And this is behind such things as drugs, people, and weapons smuggling, for example. And we know, again, from estimates that the East Asian ivory market alone is estimated to be worth about 62 million US dollars per year. And that's just the illegal ivory market going into East Asia. You can also see some other statistics there as well. I'm not going to read them all out to you, but you can see this is both a potentially growing and significant problem. Over the period of 2007 to 2015, there were seizures of 5,712 elephants worth of ivory out of Central Africa, for example. And we know that's probably about a quarter of how much ivory is actually getting out compared to what's actually being seized. So these are really big numbers, and it's having a massive impact on endangered species. So the project that I was asked to look at for the WWF in the UK was around whether we are appropriately sentencing illegal wildlife trade offences that are occurring in England and Wales in this country. So I analysed offences and I analysed the sentences passed for a period of time in England and Wales. I also did an analysis of sentencing guidelines that exist. So sentencing guidelines are advice, written down advice that's given to magistrates and judges to help set out to them what the sentences, when they're going to pass a sentence in court, an idea about where they should pitch that sentence. So it gives a range of how they should sentence and the kinds of things they should take into consideration. There aren't any sentencing guidelines for illegal wildlife trade offences, and this was one of the problems that we wanted to look at. So I looked at offences that we did have guidelines for. I also carried out interviews with CPS prosecutors, and I also ran an experts day. So I invited people from relevant conservation organisations, from the National Wildlife Crime Unit, from various police forces, from the Magistrates Association, etc., who had experience in wildlife crime to come and speak to me and to get some information from them about how they thought we should sentence illegal wildlife trade. So what did I find? I found that the sentences that are passed generally aren't consistent, and they tend to be lenient when the profits and the harms being committed in illegal wildlife trade offences are taken into account. There was some graduation in sentencing, so the crimes that seemed the worst did seem to tend to get slightly harsher sentences, but overall sentencing was very, very lenient, particularly when we think about the very large range of harms that are caused by this kind of behaviour. So from the quantitative research, I looked at 174 cases, and you can see that the vast majority of those resulted in a non-custodial sentence. So most people who commit this crime and get caught and prosecuted don't get sent to prison in this country. And the vast majority of the sentences were actually fines. Of those fines, again, you can see the substantial proportion of them, 88%, were a fine of £2,500 or less, which really shows the extent to which this crime isn't considered serious within England and Wales. In the sample, there were 45 custodial sentences, so people did get a prison sentence, and that tended to be under 10 months, and in most cases it was suspended, so they didn't actually serve that sentence as long as they didn't offend again. I also carried out what was a very cautious comparison, because the data is somewhat unreliable here, of the amount that the individual was fined and the recorded commercial value of the wildlife that they were illegally trading in. Now, this already ignores all the range of other harms that were committed. It just looks at how much that item could have been sold for on the illegal market. I had 30 cases where I had data for this, and in 21 of the 30 cases, the offender was fined less than the market value of the item that they had been committing the offence with. There were a small number of offences from the Theft Act also involved in this. So there were 3 cases of people that had stolen rhino horn from museums in the country, and they received some of the harshest sentences, which again, just to me, went to show that the courts were much more able to appropriately sentence crimes they were used to, thefts and burglaries, than they were crimes that they weren't used to, illegal wildlife trade. From the qualitative research, so the interviews and the experts day, we identified that prosecutors were very inexperienced. So most people who were working as prosecutors on these offences would never have never had a prosecution for such an offence before, because they rarely would go to court. And similarly, the judges and the magistrates hearing the cases were also inexperienced. We found that the prosecutors and the members of the experts panel felt that sentences were too lenient, and they didn't equate to the harm that was being caused, and that the courts needed to consider the impacts of this type of offending more and the ways that they needed to do this. For example, the harm, suffering, fear and loss of life of the animals themselves that were being traded, not just the impacts upon the species as a whole or on the economy. And we felt, as a result of this research, that having some sentencing guidelines that helped the judiciary to work out what an appropriate sentence was and what factors in a case made that case more or less serious was really the way to tackle this inappropriate sentencing. But that we also need to do some other things as well, which the project wasn't actually about, including improving enforcement and also making sure these kind of behaviours were better resourced as well. So this report was produced, and if you want to have a look at it, you can quickly jot down that shortened URL there, or you can just search for the title Sentencing Wildlife Trade Offences and WWF. The key recommendations in this research were that in this country we should introduce sentencing guidelines for illegal wildlife trade offences. We should improve measures of the harms being caused in these kinds of offences to make sure that sentences were appropriate. and actually that we should think about sentencing illegal wildlife trade in a similar way to other crimes that seem to be about doing the same thing. So smuggling rhino horn into the country to sell it illegally, to my mind and our experts' mind, wasn't really that different to smuggling Class A drugs into the country, but they're sentenced very, very differently. So the maximum sentence for illegal wildlife trade is 5 years under CITES regulations. And if it's under the Customs and Excise Management Act, the maximum is 7 years. But as you saw from my research, people very, very rarely get those kinds of sentences. For Class A drug smuggling, the maximum sentence is life imprisonment. And the typical sentencing range falls between 3.5 years and 16 years in prison. So you can see there's a real difference between that. And we felt that actually illegal wildlife trade should be viewed in a very similar way to Class A drug smuggling. Now, this was being used by the WWF to advocate for sentencing guidelines in England and Wales. Unfortunately, they weren't able to convince the Sentencing Council in this country that it was appropriate to introduce such guidelines. However, as a result of my work, WWF in Malaysia had heard about the research, and they too were exploring the idea of supporting the Malaysian judiciary to introduce some sort of sentencing guidelines. So I was very lucky, and they flew me out to Malaysia to go and speak to their judiciary. And I actually went to Malaysian Borneo. So I went to Sabah in Malaysian Borneo, which you can see on the map there. Malaysia, particularly Malaysian Borneo, is a mega diverse country. So it's really important in terms of its biodiversity and protecting that. It's also heavily rainforested as well. So it has a real impact in terms of climate mitigation. And it's experiencing habitat destruction and illegal wildlife trade particularly. This is a threat to lots of different species, particularly things like the pangolin and orangutans, both of which are heavily affected by this behaviour. So out I went to Malaysia, and I stayed in beautiful Sabah, and I got to speak to representatives of the judiciary of Sabah and Sarawak. I explained to them my research and my findings, and I told them about why I felt sentencing guidelines were important to make sure that sentencing for illegal wildlife trade was appropriate. And you can see some of the pictures there that were taken from while I was doing that. Very pleased to say that as a result of that, they set up a panel to introduce sentencing guidelines in Sabah for all of their illegal wildlife offences. And these were the very first sentencing guidelines ever introduced in Malaysia. And very nicely, they sort of used the work that I'd done in the research, and they sort of mentioned me in the foreword to those sentencing guidelines as well. So this is really why I would argue that criminology can indeed save the world. By exploring some of these underexplored areas and applying our criminological knowledge and expertise, we can not only carry out research to find out more about it, but we can carry out relevant research that can actually bring about change. We can make recommendations for policies that might actually be helping to tackle some of these particularly difficult issues that we're facing that aren't just about those traditional things that you've probably thought of in terms of crime, but things, as I say, such as climate change, animal harm, and biodiversity loss. So where next? I'm not going to tell you about any of my other projects, but I just wanted to kind of mention it, sort of what I'm working on now. So a couple of years ago, just before lockdown, I did some research in Ethiopia, which is still ongoing, looking at barriers to effective environmental criminal justice in Ethiopia. And this was in relation to people illegally logging protected forest areas and working with communities to try and explore why that was happening. But also speaking to people like the police and the courts to find out what difficulties there were in bringing people to justice who were actually engaged in that activity. And again, I was very lucky to go out to Ethiopia and carry out a range of these focus group interviews. I'm also doing some work around recognising animals as victims of crime and different ways that we can do that. I'm also interested in trying to sort of develop another area of criminology around vegan criminology and what that might look like and what that might mean. And I'm also interested in offence diversity of wildlife offenders, because all of the research in criminology tells us that offenders are generalists, not specialists. So all those people who are committing wildlife offences are probably committing other types of crime as well. And I'm interested in exploring what those types of crime might be and what that means for enforcement. But most importantly, the message that I would like you to take away from today is that we need to be doing something. And not only do we need to be doing something, but we need to do it now. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Melanie, for that. That was really, really interesting, and hopefully for those watching, that's just Melanie's journey of how criminology has helped her change the world. And for most of